Mom and Dad are sure. What's wrong with you?
What's wrong with you?
What's wrong with you?
But she can't shoot because everyone's hands.
This is leader.
She's really good.
So it's Anthony.
No, she,
I've not heard of these two combined before.
I'm sure I'm like next to her. His birthday is Thursday.
Yep. Yep.
Well, Quinn.
Everyone can turn their mics on. We're ready to go. Thank you. Okay, good evening. The hour being 6:53 PM on Monday, March 14, 2022. I'd like to call to order the Village of Brookfield Committee of the Whole meeting. Bridget, can we have a roll call, please?
Trustee Ketchmark?
Here.
Trustee Cote?
Here.
Trustee Hendricks?
here.
Trustee Conroy?
Here.
Trustee Leclerc?
Here.
Trustee Kaluzny?
Here.
And President Garfey.
Here. Thank you, Bridget. We have two items up for discussion. The first is a discussion approving a universal agreement for reimbursing residents for the basement flood prevention program. Carl Mule, our Public Works Director, is going to guide us through this. We have, as always, a very good memo, but Carl, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, President Garvey and Board of Trustees. Excuse me. We put a little slide presentation together for this evening, and starting off, on November 4th, 2021, the staff and board had discussed the basement flood prevention program at our budget workshop. The basement flood prevention program was budgeted for $300,000 and was to be funded by the recently approved water and sewer rate. Of the three types of flood control systems, the overhead sewer is one of the choices, and it is, I take it back. I'm sorry, did I miss a slide? I did. Can you go back to this one? Okay, I apologize. The basement flood prevention program was designed to reimburse residents 50% of the cost of three types of flood control systems. The first one being the overhead sewer system, which is the most expensive and most reliable flood control system. You're basically converting a gravity sewer to a sewer with an ejector pit and a sump pump, and the 50% of the cost sharing for this type of system covers up to $5,000. Next, the backflow prevention valve with the bypass pump is the second most expensive system. This flood control system is located in a structure outside the home. You can see that the water used in the house is pumped up and over a flap valve into the village's sewer system, and the flap valve prevents water from backing up into the home. This type of system is covered 50% of cost, 50% of the cost up to a total of $4,000. And the final flood control system is a backflow prevention valve only, which is probably one of the most common that are installed. After talking with staff when this program was in existence back in 2013, this was the most popular and least expensive flood control system. Basically, this system utilizes a flap valve that will not let water flow back into the house, and water can only exit the home. The 50% of cost sharing covers the system up to $3,000. After consulting with private plumbing contractors, all three reimbursements amounts are in line with current pricing. On June 13, 2013, the board passed an ordinance approving the basement flood prevention program, and currently the board has to approve budget and expenditure amounts, and in addition, the board has to approve all changes to the ordinance. Staff had discussed with the village attorney, and after discussion, we would like to create a universal agreement for the basement flood prevention program and repeal the current ordinance. The benefits of this universal agreement would be to eliminate the need for board approval for resident reimbursement. This would streamline the process for residents to get reimbursed at a faster pace. These systems can cost anywhere between $6,000 and $12,000, and it's a lot of money for a resident to put up front and then have to wait for a long time to get reimbursed. This would also eliminate the need for the board approval to make changes to the basement flood prevention program. Like streamlining the application process could also streamline the entire process from start to finish, thereby, getting the reimbursement again to the residents in a timely fashion. So basically tonight, we are asking the board to give staff the ability to run the basement flood prevention program with the universal agreement that would be created by our village attorney. And questions?
Thank you, Carl. Does the board have any questions for Carl or Tim?
Yeah, so based on when we did this before, do you guys know basically on the breakdown of what people took advantage of as far as between the three options?
A breakdown of each type. The only staff information I've gotten from staff was that a large portion was the least expensive type of flood control. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
I think we had a few that had done the overhead sewers and a few that had done the bypass pump, but a majority are going with the basic backflow valve.
Okay.
That one.
Can you go back one more slide?
Yep.
Okay, so this one here, so I actually took advantage of this a decade ago when you guys first did this, and I did a lot of
Okay.
research into the different options. And this particular option, I just don't think it's a good option because it's so much more hardware, and the only benefit it really gives you is it allows you to use, basically now that one-way valve stops water
Right.
from coming back up from the sewer into your house during these major rain events. It also then stops water from going out, so if you shower, run your dishwasher, that water is stuck on this side of the valve and then potentially could come up. So this option has the pump that pumps it up over the valve and back into the sewer line. But it's a lot of extra hardware in your yard that could potentially fail down the road. And I know people that put that in and regretted putting it in because it did fail and was difficult and costly to service. And the only real benefit is when it's these major rain events, you can't shower or use the dishwasher. So, go outside, it's raining if you need to take a shower. I just don't think it's a good option. I just think we should strike that and use, rather than confound residents with an overly costly, unnecessarily costly option to go with either A or C and use those funds and get rid of B.
But don't you have the same problem with C with the backflow valve where if it's backflow, nothing's gonna get past it?
No, you still, nothing will get past it, but the point is just wait till the rain is stopped and water's receded. It's not gonna be that way. It's only hours.
Does that valve fail a lot though, too?
So which valve are we talking about?
On C, I mean, I understand
So
what he's
on
saying
this
here,
valve,
on
trustee
C.
Conroy is right. You have to limit your water use
Yeah.
inside the home. You don't want to use a dishwasher or laundry. You need to let the rain subside so that the pressure releases off the valve, and then you can resume using water again. Fairly common valve used, the money well spent as far as the system, and again, not utilizing too much water in a rain event.
Well, yeah, and just to clarify, it doesn't fail, but
Right.
the way it's designed, if you look at the picture, if there's pressure coming from, if the main's over here and the it activates the valve and it comes down, and that's by its design, it's just simple.
Right, no, I was referring that, it's the same concept though, as trustee Conroy is pointing out in the other one, that you would have the same problem. You have limited water usage, everything else, right?
This design, you can use as much water as you want.
Because the water's being pumped out and around and
The
out.
flail, it's pushed into the sewer
But the
system.
problem is, you're saying is it's very, too many.
There's a
points
lot of
failure.
components to it.
There's a lot to it. There's a whole nother pump. It's a huge excavation in your yard. It's prone to failure. And the alternative is just wait a few hours before you use the water. Don't use the water inside the house during the rain event. It's a minimal benefit for a considerable more expense. And I'm just saying those funds could be used towards using option A, and you get more houses and more coverage to get the fundamental issue stopped, which is the backflow. So rather than put money towards a more expensive option that has a minimal marginal benefit, use it towards option A or C, and I think you're going to get,
And C is basically B just without the pump, right? Am I understanding that right?
Correct.
yeah.
Now, they both come out with, these are outdoors, so you have a clean out either way. we're adding a clean out either way. Which is
Correct.
just as important, because then you could, so does that cause a problem with routing and?
So normally there's an extension that comes up to the top of the pipe, and you can unscrew and then you pull the whole assembly out for maintenance. So you could rod while it's out and then
Okay, so
put it
that
back
doesn't
in.
stop that, okay.
So when we started this, back in 2013, I think we had put together like a little information brochure for the residents. I would think that's something to update. I think what we found was, it was kind of an educational process. We'd have residents complaining about, the backup in their basement. They didn't know how to resolve it. So we had the information out there to help them explain, some of the options that were available. Could you walk through the process? I mean, a couple of us were on the board when we did this. So how does it work with a resident who wants to take advantage of the program?
It will primarily go through community development to start the process, and actually, it's going to be run through the community development period. And to mention the pamphlet, Emily and I are currently working on a pamphlet right now, just tweaking certain language. We wanted to make some recommendations in the process of how, it seems a little bit complicated right now, and I know, Tim, we looked at a few things, and there's, I'm trying to get to the application. So you have an application form that starts the whole process. During the application form, then you have to move towards getting 3 quotes. 3 quotes need to be submitted to the village. We need to review them. We generally would pick the lowest quote out of the 3 and get the approval for the homeowner to get the work done. The homeowner would have to pay the entire portion up front and then fill out a reimbursement form after the inspection takes place and it meets all our criteria. So now it's
Carl,
inspected.
can I stop you there for
Go
just,
ahead.
because the procedural question, so they submit 3 bids and we typically choose the lowest bidder. Is that for our reimbursement amount? Could the homeowner choose to go with a,
He's saying that's the way it was in 2013.
Okay.
We're not
Okay.
recommending that we follow that.
okay, I wasn't clear, okay.
We would almost like to recommend they get 3 quotes, but if someone were to come in with one estimate with, let's say, a plumber they're familiar with and like to get the work done, we'd like to streamline that a little bit faster and approve that.
We started talking about this already, and as
Yeah.
Carl said, we're working on a brochure, but it's fairly burdensome for a typical homeowner who may not have 3 vendors. We can't recommend, staff cannot recommend vendors. We don't recommend contractors. And a typical homeowner may not know 3 contractors in which to choose from. So we have a pretty good understanding of, especially if we go with only 2 options, the A or C, we have a pretty good sense of what that should cost. So if a homeowner came to us with an application form that, let's say they had one quote and it was way high, then we'd work with that homeowner to say, here's some, maybe give them a list of other contractors that we know of, may get that price down. But there was a lot of administrative burden, in my opinion, in the 2013, they had to get things notarized, they had to get things authorized. It just seemed like we could streamline this process if the board was comfortable with it quite a bit. And if the board endorses this, as Carl said, we'd come back at your next board meeting with the universal agreement. Once the board approves that, that is what establishes what the program would be, the criteria, the process. Then we don't have to come back to you every time somebody wants to participate in this with the board approving a payout. As long as the criteria that's being followed by the homeowner meets the criteria that's in this universal agreement, we'll be able to process that and get the people on their way.
So one of the other things I remember us doing, I mean, there was a list generated for this. Initially, there's a tremendous response, interest in going forward with it. It kind of turned into a first come, first serve, whether we run out of funding for the year, or if you shut it off for a period of time to work through things, because you'll have residents, interested in the program, they put in their application, they're getting quotes, but it takes them a little while to do that. So then someone next in the line, has their application in, they're ready to go, and they move forward. So that process can be kind of tricky navigating through, because it's not like we can instantly help everyone who wants to participate. It takes time. Some residents, they still have to come up with 50% of this.
So as they're filling out an application and they need to find $5,000 for their match, maybe that's not something they can do right away. It also seemed like we should have a limit on, how long it's out there for them. So if a resident applies, they don't have 2 years to think about wanting to do this. I mean, because they're tying up funds that way then too.
We did have a discussion with staff who was here during the last time period, and that's exactly what they did. I believe it was like 30 days they gave them to actually follow through, and then they would just kick them to the end of the list,
Right.
and we would take someone else.
Right.
But you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it is kind of tricky navigating through
Yeah.
that. And residents have to know that. I think as we put that brochure together, we want it explained real clearly how the program works. And you don't have years to think about, accepting our money on it. There's only a, limited time because there are other people that want to take advantage of that.
Can I ask, is that 30 days to get the work done, or is it 30 days just to sign the contract with?
I think it was once the application, as part of the application, do they have contracts at that point?
If it was, I believe they submitted the application, and at that point, they had their quote, they had 30 days to proceed and get the work done. And then at that point, if they hadn't had the work done, staff would move to another applicant who was next on the list.
But is it actually having the work done or having the contract signed? Because, some of the,
Scheduling's a nightmare, yeah.
That was basically having approval to get the work done, and they never got the work done. Doesn't mean they couldn't come back to it, but I know that they wanted to keep the program moving. And again, this is,
But I
this
think
was
that,
staff
I
who
think what
worked
trustee
it.
Tote's
Yeah.
point is the determination of that 30 days, is to say, to actually have the work done within 30 days can be cumbersome, because if you haven't signed a contract and the contractor, these things are gonna be done during the spring and summer when the contractors are busy, if the contractor can't get the project in within 30 days.
Well, the permit fees are waived, so wouldn't it be within 30 days they have to submit for a permit? So they don't have to have the work done within that time, but they have to, if they apply for a permit within that time period, it shows they're serious about this. But there has to be some way to not leave an open-ended time period to this.
Right.
But I think if within 30 days, you apply for a permit, so if they already have a proposal quote from a contractor, so they know what it would cost, they can submit for the permit, and if it takes, they've up to 6 months on that, but we know, the money's there for them.
Again, like I mentioned, staff actually covered this with me and how it was worked before, and it seemed to have a good system in place. We would just have to review that system one more time, and if you do decide to do the universal agreement, and when we're streamlining the process, maybe we discuss, that portion of it further and see how it worked. It was a very general discussion at the time.
I think the universal agreement sounds like a good idea to be able to make quicker decisions and turn things around faster. I don't totally know how that works to repeal the other ordinance, but is that ordinance still in play right now, even though it doesn't have funds?
Well, that's what Adam is for.
Thanks, Adam.
Yes, part of the ordinance to approve will just be to repeal any other prior ordinances that are inconsistent with this new ordinance, and this new ordinance will take precedent over any inconsistencies from prior ordinances. So I imagine that the universal agreement will have baseline requirements similar to the current contract, but there's going to now be more flexibility on village staff to make decisions that are specific to a case-by-case basis. And those decisions or those factors will be left outside of the universal agreement for administration to handle. But whatever we put in the universal agreement will be universal across the board for everyone. So I'll work with staff on whatever they think is the bare necessities that they'll never deviate from. Might as well put those in the universal agreement. And then if there's anything that would be left to discretion on a case-by-case basis as a requirement to receive the reimbursement, that'll be left to staff.
I have a question. You said that it's going to be managed through community development. Do you feel that, you feel comfortable that we have enough staff to handle the additional workload?
The actual inspections will be through BNF, the plumbing inspector, so we discussed with Emily, and she did not see a problem.
My guess, I've run a program like this in a previous position. The first year we do this, it will be the most interest. Second year, it'll be less. Third year, it'll be less, and it'll just keep going down. The beauty of now versus back 2013, I don't know what funding source you used back in 2013, but it was temporary. Doug, what was did the village get a grant in 2013?
sewer revenue, it's just an obligated sewer revenue.
The beauty is now, at least from an administration standpoint, you approved a 18% rate adjustment last year. So we have dedicated, like we talked about the workshop, we're gonna take 300,000 every year and just reserve that in the fund. So I'm guessing that's gonna be plenty of money to handle. But I understood the demand was 9 years ago or so. I think we'll have enough money to handle it. Yeah, the existing, from the staff perspective, our contractor, B&F, will be the primary inspection. We'll just be paying them a little bit more to do more inspections. If it becomes a burden, then we may have to come back maybe as part of the budget workshop. But I'm not anticipating that the tasking, this kind of program should not result in undue hardship on staff.
Sure. And hopefully streamlining the application process will streamline the review process for staff as well.
It becomes, once you get into this, it becomes fairly regular. I mean, it'll mechanized and routine, and
Great.
that's the goal of the Universal Service Agreement. We want to bog up your time with every single request. Staff, that's a lot of staff administration time to go through that. This will be a much easier process. There'll be additional tasking, no doubt, but once it starts taking hold, it'll become just kind of SOP, standard operating procedure.
Back to the list for a minute. I mean, you mentioned the first year will be the most interest. I mean, that's what we saw before, and it was kind of waning by, the fourth, fifth year on it. But managing that list for the first year, again, is going to be tricky because most likely we're not going to be able to accommodate everyone who puts a request in on that. So, managing that list and someone who decides they don't want to do it, someone who moves, and had their name on that list is, that's going to be a tricky part to this because not everyone's going to be able to be funded probably that first year.
And I sort of, the records that we have from the previous program, I mean, do we know approximately, I mean, Carl, you said most people chose option C, the lowest cost option, but, Trustee Conroy raised some concerns about the benefits of option B. Do we have any idea how many people chose option B, and do we have any history of problems? Or, I mean, I don't doubt Trustee Conroy's, concerned that some people have had problems, but how does the board feel about ruling out option B as an option? I'm just thinking of a scenario, I mean, telling people not to use their water just during the period of the flood, might seem simple, skip a shower or a dishwasher, but I'm just thinking if there's people that want that option because there's any type of need or medical need to use water, that type of thing that, I don't know, do we want to, how does the board feel about taking that option off the table?
I'm okay with taking it off, but I'm also okay with leaving it in if you explain the amount of disruption. So like if in the pamphlet it says this is the most disruptive to your yard and this is the but you also get to use water. Like if you can make it very easy to understand like what you get and what you don't get with each option, but also this is the least invasive, this is the most invasive. I feel like those are the things that I wouldn't know until I had a contractor to ask. So calling it these names doesn't mean much to me. It's more the description of what happens.
Well, I don't, and I see how the board or the staff, I mean, I almost feel better leaving the contractor to explain the various options of what's available. But, I mean, in reality, isn't option A, because it's the most expensive, have the most work, the most, expense in terms of equipment and everything else?
The overhead sewer system?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very expensive.
So, it gives you more, I mean, Trustee Conroy's proper in, saying that, okay, option B has more hardware and more chance to fail than option C, but option A, which some people might want to just go for that solution, also has more hardware and infrastructure and that type of thing. So I just want to throw it out to the board. How do they feel about taking away option B? Or
I would rather leave all the options on the table, let the homeowner decide, let them make the decision on their home, and just present pertinent information. I mean, we can't give recommendations of what we think is best, but I think we should at least lay out the information, let the contractor explain it to them, and then let them make the informed decision for their home.
I'm okay either way, leaving it in or taking it out, so.
I mean, my experience in the past when this did happen, there was the people that got it done. They all talked to each other, and back then it wasn't even as common on social media, but I mean, people, when they're looking to do this, they talk to their neighbors, they find out who's had it done, they talk. So, I mean, anecdotal stories from their neighbors about, okay, I did this, we had this problem, we didn't have this problem. But I just, saying we're going to, a little concerned about saying we're going to take away funding from option B just because we think that we think there's a better chance of failure or the benefit isn't there. We could leave it, one option is to leave it up to the homeowners to decide what they want to do in terms with it. I mean, our investment is half of it. And if in the past, not a lot of people chose that option, I guess that, means we're not necessarily throwing away money at that point. I haven't done it. I don't know which option I would go with, but I wouldn't want to just presuppose, just tell people don't use water during a flood event. And if people want to pay more for that particular option or take on the additional hardware infrastructure or risk of that, I think maybe we should leave that option open for them.
And I think, sorry, I think I agree with Trustee Kaluzny that if we give enough information, we ought to be able to let the residents decide for themselves, especially maybe even just saying something like, each system has different maintenance requirements, and you may want to look into that. Just advising the homeowner that they should look into that, because it sounds like that's part of the big concern with B, is that it can perhaps fail or requires different maintenance.
And I just want to make sure too that none of these address seepage. This is all sewer. So if the brochure could also make sure to explain that, I think some people don't realize that that's not going to solve that problem.
Trustee Kaluzny, that's a very good point. Really, what the board is, if we do this program, which I think we should, this is an admission that sewage coming into through their drains is public, that's a public infrastructure problem. And Derek and I debate and arm wrestle about this all the time. This does not solve our sewage problem. If every homeowner in Brookfield were to do one of these things, one of these improvements, that sewage has got to go somewhere. We're not solving the problem. But what we're addressing is, if you want to take the initiative, you are helping solve for yourself a public transmission problem. Seepage is if you have a crack in your foundation, you've got a leaky water well, window well, I should say, that is not going to be addressed in this issue. That's a private property concern. That is something homeowners have, and we will make sure that the brochures cover that. But you're absolutely right. A lot of homeowners who come home and see water in their basements don't always know where that water's coming from. Water coming in, and I've had it in my house, through a storm sewage can still be clear water. It's not necessarily going to be black and gross. It's mostly rainwater anyways that's in there. And so understanding your home, understanding where the water comes from is a big responsibility being a homeowner, so that you are sure, if you're going to undertake one of these solutions, you are sure where the source of the water is coming from.
Previously, it was also required that if you were to participate in this, you had to agree to disconnect any downspouts from the sewer lines, as well as your sump pump. I imagine that would still be in effect.
Correct.
Well, that's the current village ordinance, isn't it? But it's required by ordinance, so it's just compliance with the ordinance, so we're not compounding the problem, yeah.
And we'll make sure when we're inspecting, let's say that if the homeowner wants to put an overhead sewers and is in this program, one of the parts of the inspection is to make sure the downspouts are disconnected, sump pumps disconnected, and so forth.
I do think you leave all three options, and explaining them to the residents are key. We want to make this as simple as we can. We also do not want, as a village staff, to be managing hundreds of projects. I mean, we're putting these funds out there to help the resident, let the resident pick the contractor, let them pick what they feel is the best option. But we don't want to be there telling them, which option to pick. I mean, there's reasons you would pick any of the options. But we do not want staff handling, hundreds of projects like this.
I
The
just,
brochure is key.
I think if you're asking the contractor if he should do option A or B, it's like asking the butcher if he should have steak or salad for dinner, he's gonna go for B. And I just think you're doing a disservice. I'd be interested in getting the feedback of people that did take that option and put it in previously, what their experience has been, just anecdotally.
But I mean,
Is that not for a fact?
the past experience is most people chose option C, which was the lowest option. So if the contractors were offering A, B, and C, people made a decision. I think it's clear that people made a decision to choose C, so. I mean, I think your advice and your, anecdotal evidence is well taken, but I don't know that we, as a board, should be making that decision for people anytime. I mean, I think Trustee Ketchmark's right. We gotta be careful here. The brochure should explain the basic options, but it's basically consult your professional plumber in terms of which option you wanna go with, and they could decide the various options. But I don't think people necessarily gonna be just convinced to go. If that was the case, they'd take the most, we would have seen option A was the most sold option because that's the highest priced one, and that's what they would try and sell, so. I mean, I think this was a very popular program in the past, and I think there's a lot of pent-up demand for it. People have brought it up, do we have it anymore? What are we doing? So I think there'll be a lot of pent-up demand in the beginning, and then most people have a very positive experience with it and share it. And I think, Trustee Ketchmark pointed out that the demand might be very high the first year, and you might have to put people over. We have a large sum of money in there, so let's see how it goes. But I think there's a clear consensus on the board, and we approved the rate increase, and we made it a point that part of that rate increase should go towards this program. So I think there's a clear consensus to go forward, and obviously we like to see the documentation and the exact plan before we approve it, so.
Okey-dokes.
Anybody else have any questions?
Didn't we, was it a couple years ago, didn't we mandate for like a tear down rebuild of a home that they had to put in the overhead sewer system? Was that a requirement? There was something, it came out like in a meeting, I don't know if it was a,
That's an MWRD requirement that's been around since the seventies, so.
that they had to put in
overhead
something.
Sewers are just the current plumbing design now.
Okay.
For new construction or major tear downs?
But didn't we had a young couple came in about 2 years ago, I thought it was, and discussing because they had just bought a house and they had a backflow problem. But I want to say it wasn't a complete tear down. Maybe they left the basement up. And then I thought that we put in a requirement that they had to put in an overhead system if they did that kind of a construction as well, which wouldn't necessarily be a full-on new construction, but I thought there was a mandate for that.
I think that we talked about a percentage. I think,
Is that
so
what
if
it
you're
was?
doing a certain percent, I mean, I don't know if it was 50% or whatever, if you're doing a major remodel, that you still
Maybe
needed.
that's what it was, right.
Right.
Well, you do remember, we did discuss this, I can't remember
something on that.
mandate. I think there was the overhead sewer system.
Okay. Carl, thank you for that. The other item we have for discussion is a discussion of the lead service line replacement notification act. Derek, are you going to take a lead on it?
Yes.
So Derek Trickle, our village engineer, will present on this. Again, the board has a very detailed item, committee item memo, but Derek, if you can kind of give us a little presentation on this.
Sure. Well, I think as many or all of you have heard, last year, the Illinois legislature passed the Lead Service Line Replacement and Notification Act. Basically, that's an act trying to eliminate lead services from community water systems, and we want to come before you tonight to provide some background and information on what's contained in the act. We anticipate that this will be one of several meetings that we're going to have, and tonight we're really here for just presenting information to you. We're not asking for decisions. We can have discussion, but we anticipate coming back in either 2 or 4 weeks where staff will present some approaches that the village can take to comply with the requirements. Quickly go over the agenda we put together for the meeting, go over the background of the act, give a summary of the regulatory requirements. There are, as part of the regulatory requirements, we'll go over the material inventory requirements and the lead water service replacement plan. We'll also talk about requirements for future lead water service repairs. We'll also discuss what the future requirements will be for future water main replacement projects. Have some ballpark estimates of cost to give to you. We'll discuss funding opportunities, and then we'll conclude with current issues that we have based on the act and next steps for the board. So the purpose of the act, and I'm going to read this kind of word for word, this comes right from the act, but owners and operators of community water supplies have to develop, implement, and maintain a comprehensive water service line material inventory and lead service line replacement plan. So those are two of the basic requirements. We have to have an inventory and a replacement plan, and I'll go into more detail on each of those. We also need to provide notice to occupants of potentially affected buildings before we do any construction or repair work on water mains outside their house or lead service lines. And we also need to prohibit partial lead service line replacements except as authorized. I'll go into the as authorized. What's a partial lead service replacement line? So per the EPA, the definition of the full lead service is going to be from the water main all the way inside the house to the meter. And what it prohibits is leaving, anytime we touch that lead water service, cut into it for any reason, we need to replace that entire section from the water main up to the meter, again, unless we get a waiver, and I'll discuss that a little further.
When you say we, what if the homeowner does something with that?
So in the example of a homeowner either doing a repair on their private portion of the line or a proactive replacement, the village also needs to replace the public portion of that line.
Okay.
Okay? Again, if you can, this is again from the act. General Assembly found that there is no safe level of exposure to lead. They found that lead service lines can convey this harmful substance to the drinking water supply. Illinois is estimated to have over 680,000 lead-based service lines in operation. There's many estimates you can find online. I saw from 680,000 all the way up to 1.4 million. Just interesting fact, Illinois is estimated to be the state in the nation with the most lead services, and Chicago's the city in the nation that has the most lead water services. And again, they found for the general health safety of its residents, all lead water service lines should be disconnected from the drinking water supply. That's essentially what the act is about. I want to talk a little about the lead testing that is required and has been required for years for all of the municipalities. So Brookfield, based on the size and number of services in our water system, has been required to test samples from 30 water services, and they do it on a rotating 3-year cycle. Last testing was completed in Brookfield in 2020, and all of the services that were tested have passing results. One of the ways that we know the lead services, getting any lead in your water is bad for the health. What they do is the water supplier, which in our case is the Brookfield North Riverside Water Commission, treats the water with phosphate. And what that does is it creates a protective coating on the inside of these lead service lines. So in situ, we have this protective coating, but what the act is identifying is anytime we cut into that, we disturb that coating, and now the lead particles have an opportunity to flow down that water service.
When that happens, how long before that coating can rebuild?
Varies, can be up to a week, a month, and the longest I saw was estimated was up to a year.
Wow.
Yeah. Put together a nice little exhibit here per Mr. Weiberg's request, so we could talk about.
It is nice, Derek.
Thank you.
It's pretty.
So want to make sure, we're going to be talking about the public portion of the water service and the private portion of the water service. And yeah, as you see, Tim's floating. So the water service begins at the water main where Tim's floating in the street, and it runs towards the house and eventually gets to a valve that's located in the parkway. And you may have heard it referred to as a B box, stands for Buffalo box, which is actually the riser pipe that gives access to that valve.
And
So-
nobody knows, I've asked engineers why it's called a buffalo box. Nobody knows.
I think it was created when they cast it, it started in Buffalo. And as long as no one looks on their phone, I
Yeah.
won't be wrong tonight.
It's a good guess.
But in general, from the B box, from that valve at the B box to the water main is considered the public portion of the water service. And per our ordinance in Brookfield, that's owned by and maintained by the village. So we're responsible for all costs from the B box to the water main. The second portion of water service starts at the valve at the B box and runs into the house and eventually to the water meter. And we're referring to that as the private portion of the water service. And per our ordinance, it doesn't necessarily define that that is the residence portion, but because our portion is limited to the main to the B box, the resident is typically responsible for maintaining and any cost for replacement of the private portion of the water service. So stop there. Any questions on that? Does that make sense, what I described?
And maybe you're gonna cover this coming up, but what happens when we do street work and put in the new water mains? Are we replacing any of that?
In the past, we've always replaced the public portion. So we put a new copper water service from the water main to the B box, and then we connect to it on the downhill side of that, we connect to the existing service.
Okay.
New requirements now, and I will go into all of that, okay? Okay, again, lots of information in the act. I don't know, I think we attached it, 35 pages. I tried to highlight it if someone wanted to read through it and not get into all the detail, but we can really boil it down to three main requirements. As of January 1st, 2022, no more partial lead service replacement. So if we're doing a repair, an emergency repair, a proactive repair, someone wants to replace part of a lead service, it's got to be the entire lead service, or unless a waiver is obtained from the property owner for the private portion of their water service. So anytime a lead service is cut into, the village is going to be replacing from the water main to the B box. No exceptions to that. We have to do that. So that could be a resident has a leak on their portion of the lead service. They do a repair. We've got to put copper in from the water main to the B box. Resident hears about the lead service and they want to come out and replace their private portion from the B box to the house. We need to replace our portion from the water main to the B box. If we do a water main project or we do a repair on the public side, of course, we need to replace the public portion with a copper water service. The resident will be either someone, the village can choose to do it on their own if they're gonna pay for the private portion, or the resident can be asked to pay for it. If they choose not to, they need to sign a waiver saying they decline to replace the private portion of the water service, and that's the waiver that I'm speaking of. So that's the first portion of the new regulations. The second is by April 15th, 2024, we need to submit a final lead water service inventory to the EPA, and I'll go over in more detail to that on the next few slides. And the third requirement is by April 15th of 2027, we need to submit a final lead water service replacement plan. It's a proactive program for going through the village. In our case, it's gonna be over 20 years, replacing all of the lead's water services. Okay, so I mentioned I'd go into more detail on the inventory requirements and then on the lead water service replacement plan. So the final complete lead service material inventory is due April 2024. However, they have an initial inventory due April 15th of 2022 and an updated material inventory due April 15th, 2023. As far as the private portion of those water services, we're in good shape. We won't have great data by this first submittal, April 15, 2022, but as we discussed earlier with the MTU replacement project, we included in the specifications that the contractor needs to provide documentation as far as the service material that's within the house, and that represents what we think the entire private portion will be. So we anticipate we'll either be 100% complete by April 15th, 2023 with those MTU replacements or very close to it. And at the same time, we are going to have all of the data for what's inside the house and on the private portion of those water services. Then we have to come up with an evaluation of the public portion of the water service info. So a little background, lead water services were prohibited in 1986 and going forward. So we know any water mains that were replaced since then, the public portion, if we put services in, is not lead, it's copper. Between 65 and 86, that's when copper transitioned in as a replacement of lead. So we have a 20-year period where we would have to estimate whether or not we have a lead or copper service. From all the research I've done, it was kind of unique to each individual municipality. Carl and I have talked. One good thing is we didn't have a lot of water mains replaced from 65 to 86. But where we did, we'll go out and maybe dig some test holes and determine whether the copper was put in for the public portion or whether lead was put in for that public portion. That's a smaller amount. As we get into it, we'll identify how much that is. And then any of our original water mains, most of our village, as we know, was developed prior to 65. And on those original water mains, if it's the original service, it's more than likely going to be a lead service in the public portion. Some may have replaced it with a copper service on an individual basis, but we think that'd be a small percentage, maybe 1% or 2%. But that's the material inventory requirements. And then I added all this info that's collected will be added to the GIS database. Couple other requirements for the material inventory. We need to notify the owner of the building that they have a lead service within 15 days after identifying the lead service line, probably through posting on the website and making people aware that their information is on the website. And we also need to post the later water service inventories. So when we submit to the EPA each time, we need to post that on our website, or we can elect to ask the EPA to post a copy of the inventory on its website. Moving on to the lead water service replacement plan. That's of course a plan to replace the lead water service lines. Again, it's a phased in where we submit a initial plan in 2024, subsequent updated plans in 25 and 26, and the final plan is due in 27. And from what we can tell, there's a little question. I want to get clarification from the IEPA, but I believe we start our replacement plan in 2027. And if it's not then it's in 2028. Some other requirements are post the most current version of our plan on the village website. And we're currently estimated, and again, this is a gross estimate, is we have 5,000, what the heck is that, Tim? 5,000 lead service lines. Those are the public lead service lines, 5,500 private. Oh, I'm sorry, I lost my spot. So anywhere over 5,000 lead service lines, and we're estimating we have 5,500 lead service lines, you have 20 years to replace them. It's a sliding schedule by the EPA. So starting in 2027, we need to replace 5% of those lead water services per year for a 20-year program. Give you an idea, if our estimate of 5,500 is right, there's 275 services that would be replaced each year. Again, part of our plan, it must include a total number of lead water service, of just pure water services. We already have a good count on that. Total number of suspected lead water services, total number of known lead water services. We need to provide a schedule for replacing those lead water services, and you can see we have 1 to 20-year goals. We need to do a detailed analysis of the cost to replace the lead water services, include measures to address affordability and prevent water shutoffs, and consideration of different methods of structure payments. It's all part of our plan. These are all requirements that are included in the act. Other items that the lead service replacement plan must include is plan for prioritizing high-risk facilities, including preschools, daycare centers, parks, playgrounds, a map of the area with lead services and the sequence in which those services will be replaced, and measures about how we, the community water system, will inform the public about the plan and provide opportunity for public comment. We anticipate having public meetings. Okay, bear with me, I know it's a lot of information. Requirements for future lead water service repairs. We touched a little on this, but when we have an emergency repair to a lead water service, we have to notify the building owners and residents in writing the repairs been made. Notice must include warning that the work may result in sediment containing lead, practices to prevent the consumption of lead in drinking water, filters are one way, and information regarding dangers of lead to young children and pregnant women. So we'll develop a standard notice for that. We also need to, on an emergency repair, so when we have imagine a leak on the service that we go out and repair, we can't always automatically replace that full length from the water main to the B box. We may just go out and do a repair. So if we choose to just do the repair, we need to provide filters for at least one fixture in the house for drinking water. And that filter has to be provided until the entire lead service has been replaced or a waiver's been obtained from the property owner. And they give time frames for how long we have after that emergency repair to the service. During normal weather, nice weather where we can do the construction, we have 30 days after the initial emergency repair was done to complete the full repair. Or during periods over the winter, or if we have poor weather where we can't do the repair right away, they will allow up to 120 days to complete the full repair. Again, we're providing filters to the residents, to the property owner for the entire time until that full repair is done. And if the lead service for some reason can't be replaced within the designated time period, we have to notify the IEPA and provide reasons why that replacement cannot be completed. If this next section addresses if a property owner of a non-residential building, commercial, or a residence operating as a residential property denies the complete replacement and wants to sign the waiver, then that property owner has to install and maintain point-of-use filters at all fixtures that are intended for drinking water supply, food preparation, or making baby formula. And that could go on for quite some time. Once they sign the waiver, that's in effect until they choose to replace that service. I want to mention too, I didn't touch base, if you sign that waiver, my understanding is that goes on as a rider on your, if you sell your real estate, similar to declaring basement flooding, you have to declare that you have a portion of a lead service line. And B was continue to supply filters until the lead water service is replaced. Of course, we need to keep records of that and periodically check in. And ultimately, if we have any of these partial lead services or private lead service, we need to document any portions and keep data on that and post it on our website for addresses that file this waiver.
So Derek, just for, if
Sure.
someone applies for one of those waivers, is it up to the village then to monitor these supply filters and check in on them on a regular?
You know, and it's not included in the act, and I'll research that. It seems like on behalf of the residents living here, we may want to, but we'll come back and do a little more research. If it's a requirement, we have to, right? Then we have no.
Well, I assume, sorry, I mean, it seems like it's another onerous burden if these homeowners sign off on these waivers and then we have to, we're responsible for making sure they have these filters and they have them for the appropriate period of time on each fixture. I mean,
I know. And part of it is, don't forget, we're providing notice to the, let's call them tenants or the people in a commercial building. So they should at least be aware of that. That should be their expectation. But you're right. The monitoring and enforcement could be onerous.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Next, I put a little section together regarding future water main replacement projects. How is that gonna affect us? So what we need to do is identify any lead services connected to the water main. Just FYI, we've been in the basements on, we have a 26-place water main. We've made appointments. We've been in there and identified where we have lead water services. We need to include full replacement of all lead water services that are disturbed. So right now, as part of our project, we always, as in the past, we've included bid items for replacing from the water main to the B box. What's new this year is we have items in there for replacing from the B box up until the meter. And I'll go into a little further discussion on that later, but right now we're prepared to, our bid documents will include pay items for that private portion of the.
What percentage of 26th Street had lead? I mean, just
I think there was 25 homes, 4 had copper, and to be clear, though, they must have been our thought is they were probably proactive and replaced their service with copper. And I don't know if that's representative of
Sure.
the rest of the village. We also have to notify the affected property owners that we're gonna be doing work that will impact their lead service. Again, let them know what the dangers, there's standard notices out there. We're gonna get those on Brookfield letterhead and make sure those go out to the residents as part of the project. And provide the written notice regarding the dangers of lead sediment. Next, they talk about if the property owner refuses to grant access to the property or otherwise refuses to replace the private portion, then we still have to replace the public portion of the water service and obtain a waiver from the property owner. Okay, very ballpark estimates of costs. These are order of magnitude. They're based on assumptions for how many services we have. These services are for 20 years. I'm telling you, these are what probably conservative for this year, but they give you an idea. The public portion of the water service replacement, we have about 5,000 services times 4,000 apiece. It's $20 million. A lot of sticker shock. It's a 20-year replacement program. $1 million a year would cover you at, yeah. In my head, I did that one. Private portion of the water service, 5,500 of those, again, estimated, 8,000 a service. We haven't bid those out. I think those are reasonable. I think we might see prices from 5,000 to 8,000, but if 8,000 is the number, then that's $44 million that we're looking at over the 20 years. I will say the Act requires that they be replaced or you obtain a waiver. It does not require that the village has to pay for the private portion. That's a policy decision. The villages are all gonna be looking whether they're gonna pay for the private portion and undoubtedly add the cost to the water rate, or whether they're gonna have the residents pay for that. And we'll get into that and come with recommendations at the next meeting. Right, tonight there's a lot to cover. We thought we'd just go ahead and provide the information to the board. There are some funding opportunities. The good news, there's IEPA has the revolving loan fund. They currently have a program where you can apply for up to $4 million per year for just lead water service replacement. Don't know that that's gonna be a very popular program. Don't know that all the villages are gonna get 4 million. We're gonna see how this plays out. But that is an option for us, is to apply for that program. That wouldn't be something we could get for this year's replacement, but we could get, if we were awarded funds, 2023 would be in play for us. They also have the standard low-interest loan that we've talked about before for capital water main improvement projects. And as part of that standard low-interest loan, if you're doing water main replacement, they allow up to $400,000 as part of that project for replacing lead water services. We'll look into more. That might be only applicable to low to moderate income areas. We do happen to have one area in town that is low, considered low to moderate income.
Derek, with the option A, it says under the program with loan forgiveness of 100%. I mean, what is that?
It's the IEPA's way of talking about a grant. It's essentially a grant. So they make loans, it's through their loan program, but when they say loan forgiveness, that means principal forgiveness is another way of saying it. So it's a grant. So
Okay.
the 4 million would be a grant, essentially. I mentioned we'll wrap up with current issues and next steps. So I already hit a little bit, on 26th Place, we do have a capital improvement project. We're replacing a little over 1,000 foot of water main. We'll replace the water main, the service from the main to the B box. And we did, I mentioned, include a bid price for replacing the service from the water main to the meter. The village is not committed to that. We have time. Construction on that water main won't start till June at the earliest. So we have until at least June to develop our policy and practice as far as whether the village is gonna pay for that private portion of the water service, or whether we're gonna put the onus of paying for that on the residents, and then we'd give them a option of taking advantage of those unit bid prices that we have in the contract. If that's the way we go and residents choose not to do it, it's a each item, so let's say they bid 8,000 each and 10 of them chose to do it and 10 chose not, then the 10 that didn't, we would just not pay for the 10. Our pay item would read 20 each, but we'd only pay for 10 each if we installed 10. So we have some time on that, but over the next couple months, that's probably the big decision, is how to fund the private portion of the water service. And it looks like I jumped into number 2. So one of the issues that we are struggling as staff to wrap our heads around and come up with a good recommendation is, if we do put the onus of paying for the private portion of the water service on the property owner, it makes the grant funding a little bit more difficult, because the grant funding, when you're getting loan forgiveness, can only be used when you are replacing 100% of the lead water service. So that if you have a lead water service from the main to the meter, and we replace from the main to the B box, but the resident says, no, I don't want to pay for that, that's okay, but we can't use any of that loan forgiveness money towards that lead service. We'll have to see how that goes. We don't know what percentage will say that. If the 4 million covers ballpark 300 to 350 services, if we had 25 residents say, I don't want that private portion replaced, I've talked to the EPA, we could choose 25 others in the area and go ahead and replace them. What I don't know is if we have a high turnout, a high percentage of residents say, I don't want that replaced, how do we handle that? And if we are, I'll foreshadow, I told you we weren't gonna get into the decisions, but there's gonna be a decision on how we equitably handle, how do we use grant funding to replace all of one person's water service when we can't guarantee that we're not gonna have the funds to replace everybody's water service. So over the next month, that's what staff will be working on, to come up with some recommendations for the board, and that'll be the focus of our next discussions. Next steps, we'll develop a public outreach and education plan. We're gonna get items on the website. We're gonna include information in the water bills and possibly the quarterly newsletter. So more to develop. A month from now, we'll present that plan to you, but those are some ideas we've discussed already. We will also begin the inventory of lead water services, particularly with the MTU replacement, but we'll also start looking at the public portion. Third is develop Brookfield's approach for payment of the private portion of the water service. I think that's, in my opinion, maybe one of the tougher decisions we face. And then at some point, I anticipate we'll apply for a low-interest loan from the IEPA for water main replacement. We did raise our rates. We wanted to accelerate our replacement schedule on our old water mains that are over 100 years old. And then we may also want to apply for money for the lead water service replacement. That is what I mentioned, that we have up to $4 million a year is what you can apply for. So a lot of information, and I'm gonna tell you, I sat here, I met with Doug, Tim, and Carl, and presented this to them. We started making decisions, and it was tough. Tim was frustrated, saying, well, why'd they do it? You know, how are we gonna pay for this? There's a lot of frustration. So I thought I'd come and present the information to you and not necessarily ask for decisions right now. I think we have to look at this, and I think we talked at couple board meetings from now, we'll try to come back and present a proposed plan and open it up for discussion.
Derek, thank you for the detailed presentation. Obviously, we're not going to talk money or financing tonight. Does anyone have any questions about the requirements of the state law or the process that we have to go through? Like I said, we're not going to talk funding tonight, but anybody have questions?
This is all directional boring? This isn't trenching or excavation, it's all boring, is that correct?
Ideally, and so some of the work in the parkway, there's two types of water services. The mains, there's a short water service that's located, if the main's under the curb, the B-box is 10 feet away, that's open cut on that short water service. Same as it's always been on all our capital projects. When we go under the roadway, that's directional boring where we can. Typically, we can get around existing utilities, so I anticipate that again. And the private portion is the important part, is we do anticipate directional boring. That's kind of a blanket statement. When we have bedrock, we can't directional bore, but in general, for the area of town north of Shields, we anticipate directional boring all or the majority of our service.
And could you just explain what that means to people? I mean, you won't have to tear up the entire parkway to get from the B-box to their water main, to their water meter?
Exactly. So what you do with directional boring is you dig a pit. Ballpark might be 8 feet long by 3 or 4 feet wide at the water main. And then they actually, in most or all cases, and talking to the plumbers, what they can do is they cut about an 18-inch by 18-inch hole. I'm talking about the private portion right now. They can cut 18 inches by 18 inches out of a concrete floor, and they can sense where it's coming up, and they can hit that hole. So we're not excavating a trench for the entire length of the water service on private property.
That was my question. Oh, sorry. That was my question too. It's not, hopefully not, everyone has to rip up their sidewalk all the way back to their water meter?
No, absolutely not.
Because
Yeah,
that sounds expensive too.
It is.
Cool, thank you.
Well, some of the nightmare scenarios we've been talking about is, you know, people do a lot of things with their basements, and if they have a finished basement, and if where this private line comes into the basement, let's say you've boxed that out in mahogany wood, well, that has to be torn out. And who's gonna pay for putting back in the lovely paneling or the, you know, the, whatever may be there? I mean, these are the type of things that you get into that makes people like us get gray hair. I mean, what are we gonna do then? You know, end up having to re-drywall an area where the water line comes in. It just becomes really burdensome.
And we'll have some thoughts. We've had some discussion. We have some thoughts how to handle that from the village's standpoint.
Is this low-interest IPA loan and the other funding, is that COVID relief money that the federal government passed on to the state, and that's the state's way of passing it on to us? Or is there any, I mean, this was obviously talked about at the federal infrastructure level in terms of that. Is there any other federal help that would be coming?
I don't believe this, to answer your first question, I don't believe it's COVID relief related to that. The revolving loan fund has been around for years, 20 plus years, I would guess, for water main replacement. And what that does, it's also called the low-interest loan fund. And basically, they set the interest rate at half of what the going market is. I think it's 1.15% right now is. Now, on the lead services, the part of this act also establishes a fund, and they have language in here that they'll continue to fund as long as funds are available, so, right. But that establishes the loan forgiveness and the funding for the lead water services.
Was there part of the possible federal transportation or infrastructure bill that was passed? Was there any hope that any money from the federal government would be passed on to the states or local governments?
It is from the federal, and I'll tell you, if I could, I'd give you more. I didn't research that a lot for tonight, but I can tell you where the funding is. I've read a number of articles. I've seen a number, like 100 million, 300 million coming to Illinois, but I can talk more at the next meeting about where the funding's coming from.
Okay. Anybody else have any other questions for tonight related to this? All right, Derek, thank you for your presentation tonight. That ends the items we have up for discussion. Is there any public comment? Right side, left side? Okay, hearing no public comment, I'd entertain a motion to go into executive session pursuant to Section 2C1 of the Open Meetings Act to discuss the appointment, employment compensation, discipline, performance, or dismissal of specific employees.
So moved.
Second.
The motion was made by trustee Leclerc, second by trustee Kaluzny. Roll call, please.
Trustee Ketchmark?
Aye.
Trustee Cote?
Aye.
Trustee Hendricks?
Aye.
Trustee Conroy?
Aye.
Trustee Leclerc?
Aye.
Trustee Kaluzny?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay, we're adjourned into executive session at 8:03 PM. We do not anticipate any action coming out of committee of the whole, out of the executive session.